Well, it's a great privilege to be invited to speak at this very distinguished symposium. I've got 15 minutes to tell you what I've been thinking about for the last 50 years. Actually, it's very easy to do it in 2 minutes and very easy to do it in 2 days and very difficult to do it in 15 minutes, but we'll do our best. The thing is, whenever the powers that be, the oligarchs who rule the world, talk about the world food problem, I always ask myself in the back of my mind, what problem? Actually, there's a fantastic food problem. I mean, 1 billion people out of 7 billion are chronically hungry, another billion are overfed. World population of diabetics is now equal to roughly twice the population of Russia. The collateral damage from modern agriculture is incredible. It goes all the way from climate change to mass extinction of our fellow creatures. Half of all species are now considered to be in imminent danger of extinction, and the major cause probably is modern agriculture. So of course the problems are absolutely huge, but the point is, as B more or less intimated, I hope you heard the first bit. Where are we up to? As B, what do you have to say? It's gone right out of my head. Oh yeah, it was a good point I was coming on to. It really ran well. Anyway, when the powers that be talk about food and the great problems, they say, more or less directly, we've got to do one of two things. Either they say we have got to embrace modern technology, GMOs and all that stuff, and anybody who opposes GMOs and all that stuff is obviously, I don't know, what's the word they use, superstition and all that kind of stuff, anti-science, complete rubbish. Or they say we've got to tighten our belts, learn to live on lentils and all that kind of stuff. I like lentils myself. I think dal and chapatis, dal and rice, mangoes is one of the world's great treats. I'm sorry, I know they're foreign, but you could use English chutneys as well. But, you know, none of that is true. And what is actually the case is that sort of 98% of what the powers that be tell us about food and farming is actually wrong. And I don't know whether it's willfully wrong, that they know what's true but prefer to go down the route they're on, or whether they just are ill-informed. And I'm more and more inclined to think that certainly a lot of the scientists I know are seriously misinformed about agriculture, even though they might actually be in charge of it. Because the simple truth of the matter is that if we really set out to provide everybody in the world with good food without wrecking the rest of the world, then we could do so. And by providing everybody with good food, I don't just mean, you know, the right apportionment of protein and fat and all that stuff. I mean highest standards of nutrition and the highest standards of gastronomy. And a few years ago, incidentally, another book, what I've just written, is on sale there, called 6 Steps Back to the Land, which sort of summarizes the latest thinking. I mentioned that only because in an earlier book, and also because it's for sale, an earlier book, I coined the expression Enlightened Agriculture. And Enlightened Agriculture is loosely but adequately defined as farming that is expressly designed to provide everybody in the world with food of the highest quality, both nutritionally and gastronomically, without wrecking the rest of the world. And my point today is that that is eminently possible. And the reason we don't do it is because food policies and strategies of the world's ruling people is moving us totally in the opposite direction. And that's where we get the title of this talk, that we're simply not focused on what the problem really is. The thing is that at the moment, still, agriculture is focused on the whole idea of production. There was a report came out in 2011 by the British government which told us that we need 50% more food by 2050. And I've heard politicians since then up the ante and say, no, we need 100% more by the end of the century. And it all looks like tremendous panic, you know, we've got more. And we're told that the reason for that is firstly that the human race is breeding too fast, so it's all our fault, and secondly that we're demanding more and more food, so it's all our fault. And they're doing their best to keep up. The truth is the complete opposite, you know. First of all, we already produce enough food in the world for 14 billion people, which is twice the present world population. Twice as much food as we actually need. The second thing is, and it's easy to work this out from figures that you can get on Google. I would do it, but I haven't got long. But it's easy to work that out and show that it's true. But the second thing is that the United Nations tells us that the world population is actually, the rate of growth is slowing to the point where by 2050 the rate of growth, the percentage rate of increase will be 0, which means that the population should level off. And by then, 2050, it should be at about 10 billion. So we're already producing about 40% more food in the world than the world really needs. And it means we could take our foot off the accelerator. And instead of going for production, we should be going for quality, certainly. We should be going for kindness to animals, kindness to human society, and we should be going for kindness to the biosphere. These should be our foci, not production. So, what we actually need is what I'm calling enlightened agriculture, real farming. And what the first question is, why don't we do it? And the real point is that, as B said, the powers that be, the oligarchs, are not actually focused on the business of providing everybody with good food and looking after the biosphere. That's not the priority. The priority is to fit agriculture in with the prevailing economic theory of the day, and the prevailing economic theory of the day is that of neoliberalism. And what it says is that we must all compete on the world market to make the maximum amount of wealth in the shortest amount of time, with everybody, competing with everybody else. The idea being that competition is the natural state of human beings, which we can't possibly get away from. And in order to compete on the world market for more and more wealth in the shortest time, you have to produce more at less and less cost. And that's what drives modern agricultural strategy. However, if you want to produce more and more at less and less cost, then what you do is you get rid of most of your labor force, because if you do a sort of a quick and dirty analysis of the accountancy of any one farm, you find that the labor is probably the thing that costs the most. So if you're a simple-minded person, you say we've got to cut costs, the first thing you do is cut labor. So we now in this country, for example, have only about 1% of people working full-time on the land, which is absurdly too low. You replace them with machinery, and with industrial chemistry, because both of those are cheap at the moment, because the price of oil is kept down to just below what we can afford, so that we can use lots and lots of lovely oil, and that all feeds into the economy. So the whole thing is geared to getting rid of people and replacing them with mechanization. If you do that, you have to simplify. So you go down from having a complex agriculture to having a very simple agriculture of the kind known as monoculture. And if you go down the route of simplifying and you rely on machines and you rely on industrial chemistry, then there are tremendous advantages in scale-up. So the other thing that we're told by the powers that be is that you have to scale up, make your farms bigger and bigger and bigger, get rid of small farms, get rid of farm labor. And there are now farms in the Ukraine, for example, which are a lot bigger than Kent. Individual farms I'm talking about. There are probably quite a few bigger than Yorkshire, but that's the kind of way we're going, and that is what modern people running world agriculture think is good. If you look at what enlightened agriculture entails, you find it's the complete opposite. Enlightened agriculture has 3 essential components. Agroecology, first of all, food sovereignty, second of all, and economic democracy, third of all. Very, very briefly, agroecology means that you treat each farm as an ecosystem, and you treat farming as a whole as a positive component of the biosphere, and not simply as some kind of predatory force that runs the rest of the biosphere into the ground. Food sovereignty means that everybody in the world should have control of their own food supply, which seems a very basic principle, but as B said, it's simply absolutely not true, because most of the food most people eat now comes from elsewhere and is controlled by huge powers over which we have no control at all. And economic democracy implies things like much more egalitarian economy, but also what's called social enterprise and such like devices as that. But let's get back to agroecology, the main thing. If you want to go down an ecological route, you say we've got to emulate nature. And you don't emulate nature slavishly, because nature does a lot of things that are very bad, but you emulate the good things that nature does, which enables it to be really quite productive, but also incredibly sustainable. It's been sustained for 3.8 billion years, and very resilient, so that even though the climate changes like mad and continents drift all over the surface of the globe, nature still keeps battling on. And that's what we need, is reasonable productivity, sustainability and resilience. And the way nature achieves this, first of all by being very, very diverse, secondly by being low input, and secondly by being, well, those two things really. Diversity in agriculture means that you need mixed farms, not monocultures, but polyculture, and low input really translates into organic farming. If you have a low input, diverse farming, you've got to have lots of people working on the land, not as few as possible, but a really skills-intensive agriculture. If you have a skills-intensive agriculture with lots of farmers, very complex systems, there's really no advantage in scale-up. So in general, the farms we actually need will be small to medium-sized. And instead of importing everything, we could and should be aiming for self-reliance, which we could easily achieve. We could easily produce 100% of all the food that we actually need in this country. And then we could use imports to import things that we don't grow very well, like coffee, like tea, and actually like bananas, but you know, tea and coffee will do to start us. If you advocate this to the people, the powers that be, they say, or indeed to anybody, they say, but would enlightened agriculture, small mixed farms, etc., produce enough food? And the answer is, excuse me, we'll keep you in suspense. Absolutely it would. And there was another report produced in 2008, before the British one, which pointed out, by international scientists, which pointed out that small mixed farms the world over, traditional type farms, already produce at least 50% of the world's food. And another 20% comes from people's back gardens and fishing and hunting. Pity it comes from hunting and fishing, but there we are. So it means that the industrial kind of farming that we're now told is the only way forward produces only about 30% of the world's food, even though it gets sort of something like 90% plus of the investment in the form of research money, etc., etc., etc. And bear in mind that the 50%, the small mixed farms that now produce 50% of the world's food are seriously neglected by the powers that be. They're not given subsidies, they're not supported, and in fact they are actively dumbed down, and yet they still produce half. And all the people I know who know third world farming well say that these small farms could generally double or triple that output if only they had a few sort of logistic help. For example, small-scale banking, so they could borrow things, and decent roads, so they could get stuff off the farm during the rainy season, and that kind of thing. And best of all, they need stable markets, so they've got someone to sell to, and they know that if they invest in doubling their output, they can actually sell the produce at the end. The whole thing is stacked against small mixed farms, and yet, in the world at large, they produce about 50% of the food. So, then the question arises, if you got all this food from small mixed farms, would it be the right kind of food? Would it meet this so-called thing of rising demand? And the answer is, and this is really the thing that really matters, I think, to this conference, is that there is an absolute one-to-one correspondence between enlightened agriculture, in other words, agriculture that is expressly designed to produce good food for everyone, enlightened agriculture, and sound nutrition, everyone healthy, and the very, very best gastronomy. This is the point. And if you look at it, the argument is actually very simple. If you farm along ecological lines, you will be focusing on arable and horticulture, in other words, on plants, and you will be fitting in your animals where you can. You'll be raising your ruminant animals, basically cattle and sheep, on grassland which is too steep or too wet or too dry or too steep to use for anything else. There's loads of animals you can produce from land you couldn't really farm in any other way. and you produce things like chickens and pigs in small holdings where they basically live on leftovers. Now, if you farm like that, you will produce plenty of plants, and you won't produce much meat, but you will, because you're focusing on diversity, produce maximum variety. And if you take just 9 words, plenty of plants, not much meat, and maximum variety, you've actually summarized the best of the last 50 years of nutritional theory. I promise you that. There's loads of books on it, but you can summarize it in 9 words. Furthermore, and I'd be very pleased to have, for example, Claudia Roden's comments on this, a chap called N.W. Pirrie, known as Bill Pirrie, who worked for the Rothamsted in the 1950s and 60s, pointed out all that time ago that all the world's great cuisines, the greatest cuisines, make only sparing use of meat. And as he said, they only ever use meat for garnish. I think that's not quite true. I think great cooks also use meat and bones and all the rest of it for stock. I think, Italians with a good stock and the game's over, you can just do anything you like. Anyway, leave that aside. Garnish and stock, and of course the occasional feast. Used to be in my day, it was sort of chicken once a week or something like that, and turkey once a year, that kind of thing. That's what the traditional cuisines do. So it therefore seems to me, and if you then will go down the route of plenty of plants, not much meat, and maximum diversity, well, that's it. You are producing enough meat to support the world's greatest cuisines. I'm talking about Turkish, Persian, Indian, Chinese, Southern Italian, etc., etc. So we easily produce enough meat, and we can easily go on producing enough meat to support all the world's greatest cuisines. So as I said at the beginning, what actually is the problem? All we've got to do is relearn how to cook. Not hard. And farm properly, farm the way people traditionally think that farming ought to be farmed. The only trouble with that is it's the exact opposite of what the powers that be tell us we need to do. So then the final question is, how do we get from where we are to where we need to be? Well, we've established, as B said, the Campaign for Real Farming, and now we're establishing the College for Real Farming, which sets out systematically to explore that very question. What do we need to do to get from where we are to where we need to be? And we're running a couple of symposia later this year. I won't plug them now, but I should. September and October, to discuss this kind of issue. But on the broad scale, I think there's no doubt that we really need in this country a new agency for food and farming. Food and farming is too important to be left to governments. They screw it up seriously year after year. I don't think we've had a proper food policy or agricultural policy since about 1970. Which is when memories of the Second World War finally started to fade. After the Second World War, governments took farming and so on quite seriously, and the chap in charge was a chap called Lord Boyd Orr, who was one of these brilliant Scotsmen. Scots seem to produce these people, who was a doctor and a theologian and a great scholar and a wonderful moralist, and ran it beautifully, according to the kind of enlightened principles. But when memory of the war faded and people started to think that they didn't really have to produce food anymore, we went back to the old idea of food just being something that you produce and sell. And ever since then, we've not had a proper policy. And the kind of people who are now in charge of agriculture, the last few secretaries of state, have been dreadful. For example, the last but 2 told us that farmers needed to produce more beef to sell to the Chinese. That was Owen Paterson. The one before last, who was, I can't remember her name now, Liz Truss, said we have to produce more pork to sell to the Chinese. And the one that's just gone, Angela Leadsom, said that we should use the lowlands for farming, by which she meant more beef and more pork to sell to the Chinese, and the butterflies for the hills. I mean, the hills for the butterflies. Most butterflies don't live on the hills, but bad luck on the butterflies. But you see the kind of thinking that we've got. And we need a new agency with better thinking at the top. Secondly, we need to gear the economy to the needs of humanity and to the needs of the biosphere. We need it to be guided by morality on the one hand and by ecology on the other. And it isn't. It's just geared to the idea that we need to make the maximum amount of money in the shortest amount of time. And I think the third very big thing that we need to do is to rescue science, because science should be a huge contributor to the future. We should be developing, for example, the science of ecology, which is what should underpin modern farming, enlightened farming, and that's seriously neglected. Whereas we are developing things like molecular biology for genetic engineering, etc., etc., etc. Tremendous bit of science. I love it. You know, I used to do science was my thing, but not appropriate to producing these GMOs and so on, so on, so on. As I say, the College for Real Farming and Food Culture is exploring all this stuff, and you're exploring it all here. But the take-home message is the one right in the middle. Great cooking, good farming, sound nutrition go perfectly together. So all we really have to do is to relearn how to cook, and cooks should be leading the great drive into the future. Thank you very much.